IELTS Writing Task 2, Lesson 9. We're going to look at a two-part question this week. A two-part question is simply an IELTS question for Writing Task 2 that has two parts. And it's quite easy. We're going to write one main body paragraph about each of those parts of the question, but we'll go through it step by step in a moment, just as we've done over the last few weeks for the other types of question. Today's question comes from Test 3 in Cambridge IELTS Book 1. Here's the two-part question that we're going to use. News editors decide what to broadcast on television and what to print in newspapers. What factors do you think influence these decisions? Do we become used to bad news, and would it be better if more good news was reported? Remember, we're going to plan this in 3 stages. The first stage, read and understand the question, and to help us make sure we understand, we'll highlight or underline key parts. I'll highlight first the 2 question marks just to show you that this is why I call it a two-part question. You have to answer these 2 questions. The first question is about factors. What factors do you think influence these decisions? And the second question is asking about bad news and good news. Do we become used to bad news? Would it be better if more good news was reported? The task I've put in red, but the topic I'll put in green. The topic is news editors and what they have to decide to broadcast or publish. One final thing to underline is that this is about your opinion. Do you think? Do we become? It's asking you, so it's fine to put I believe, in my opinion, that kind of thing in your answer. Moving on to step 2 in planning. Plan your essay structure, the 4 paragraphs that we always use. We'll plan the introduction first, just 2 sentences, the topic and the answer. The topic of this question is decisions about news stories, and the answer, we've got 2 parts here. The first part of the answer, a variety of factors affect decisions about news stories, and the second part of the answer, yes, too much bad news. Then we'll repeat that answer for those 2 parts in our conclusion. So we can say something like this: difficult news choices, more positive. We're repeating that it's difficult to make decisions about the news, but that we think there should be more positive news in newspapers and on television. Now we can go to the main body paragraphs, and of course in paragraph 2, the first part of the question, factors that influence news editors, and in paragraph 3, the second question, too much bad news, we should report more good. That's the structure planned. Now we can move on to part 3 of planning, which is ideas. Plan ideas for the 2 main paragraphs. In about 6 minutes. We'll take 3 minutes on each main paragraph. First, the factors that influence news editors, paragraph 2. When I saw the word factors, I immediately started to think of a firstly, secondly, finally paragraph. Let's try to have 3 ideas. So that's what I asked my students to do. Think of 3 different factors that influence the decisions of news editors. The first one they thought of was interest. News programs, stories have to be interesting and attract viewers or readers. A second different idea, to inform the public. There's a responsibility to give information. Let's explain that a bit more. Important issues and events in the public interest. In the public interest is a good phrase. It means something that the public needs to know about. And a final idea, third idea, pressure from owners. The owners of TV channels or newspapers might put pressure on editors to promote certain political views. 3 simple ideas, so obviously we can organise that as a firstly, secondly, finally paragraph, starting with number 1, a topic sentence. Sentence 2 will be the first point, firstly, then secondly, and finally. Because we've only got 4 sentences at the moment, one of those 3 points needs to be, ideally, written in 2 sentences. So we have 5 sentences overall. You'll see how I do that when I write the paragraph. We'll do the same kind of thing for paragraph 3. Too much bad news, should report more good. Let's explain that in more detail with some ideas. First idea, we do become accustomed to bad news. Accustomed to means used to, different way of saying it. Let's explain that a bit more. With an example, war, crime, natural disasters, human suffering. These were examples of bad news that my students mentioned. And what's the result of all this bad news? It desensitizes us. It makes us not sensitive to what we see on television or what we read. And we become more cynical about the world. I suggested that word to my students, cynical, meaning you are not very optimistic. You don't believe that we can change the world or make it better. Then we need to move on to talk about the good news. Prefer positive news, e.g. medical workers, volunteers, kindness, something about those kinds of examples of good news. And finally, we thought of a concluding sentence for this paragraph. What would be the result of good news? News to inspire us, to make us live in a better way. Let's number those points. Try to get 5 sentences from that. We'll start with a topic sentence about too much bad news. This accustomed to bad news is the same point, so maybe that can go in our topic sentence. And then we'll move on to the examples of this bad news. And then after the examples, we'll talk about the results or the effects of bad news. It desensitizes us, makes us cynical. Then our 4th point, of course, will be about the positive news, and we'll give some examples in there, and finish with a concluding sentence, about news that inspires us. Positive news would inspire us. That's our complete plan finished. We've done the 3 steps of planning: understanding, structure, and ideas. Hopefully that would take about 10 minutes or maybe a bit less overall, and now we're ready to start writing. We have to go back, of course, to the introduction, back to our question and our plan, and then we'll just take the 2 parts of the plan and write 2 sentences. Starting with the topic then, decisions about news stories. It is true that editors have to make difficult decisions about which news stories they broadcast or publish. You can see I've got a comma there because this time I thought I would add very quickly the factors on the end of that, the first part of the answer. And their choices are no doubt influenced by a variety of factors. So I've got the topic and the first part of my answer all in that first sentence. Then I can move on to the point about the too much bad news and we need more good news. In my opinion, we are exposed to too much bad news, and I would welcome a greater emphasis on good news. There's some nice vocabulary in there. We've got difficult decisions, broadcast, publish, no doubt influenced means we are certainly influenced, exposed to, and would welcome a greater emphasis on. Some good phrases in there. That's our introduction finished, so let's move on to paragraph 2. We'll start with the first idea from our plan, variety of factors that influence news editors. We'll have a nice easy topic sentence saying this. Editors face a range of considerations when deciding what news stories to focus on. Notice that instead of using variety of factors, because I had that in the introduction, I've used range of considerations instead. That's nice variety of vocabulary when deciding what news stories to focus on. Then we come to our firstly point, interest or attract viewers or readers. We'll start with firstly. Firstly, I imagine that they have to consider whether viewers or readers will be interested enough to choose their television channel or their newspaper over competing providers. Of course, you can see I'm adding quite a lot there. I'm writing that simple idea in a much longer sentence. I started with I imagine because the question asked, what do you think are the factors? We don't know unless we are editors ourselves. We don't know what they're really thinking. That's why I'm saying I imagine. I imagine that these editors have to consider whether viewers or readers will be interested enough to choose their television channel or newspaper over. Choosing something over is like saying choosing instead of. Competing providers, that's a nice way of saying other newspapers or different TV channels. That's the firstly point done. Then we move on to our second point. Inform the public about important issues and events, things in the public interest. Secondly, news editors have a responsibility to inform the public about important events and issues, and they should therefore prioritise stories that are in the public interest. Really, I've just followed the plan on that one, made it into a full sentence. Then our finally point, pressure from owners to promote political views. Finally, editors are probably under some pressure from the owners who employ them. We'll make this into a two-sentence point. For example, a newspaper owner might have particular political views that he or she wants to promote. And that's the paragraph finished. You can see it's a firstly, secondly, finally, and for example on the end to make that fifth sentence. And it's 98 words in total. Let's do the same thing for paragraph 3. Accustomed to bad news. We'll have a simple topic sentence. It seems to me that people do become accustomed to negative news. Examples: war, crime, natural disasters, human suffering. We are exposed on a daily basis to stories about war, crime, natural disasters, and tragic human suffering around the world. Next point, what's the result? Desensitizes us cynical about the world. I believe that such repeated exposure gradually desensitizes people and we become more cynical about the world and more skeptical that we can do anything to change it. I've added a little bit in there. Repeated exposure gradually desensitizes people. That's nice. More cynical and more skeptical. When you're skeptical, you don't really believe that something can happen. So we don't believe that we can change the world when we see all this bad news. Then we move on to the positive news. Prefer positive news, e.g. medical workers, volunteers, kindness. I would prefer to see more positive news stories, such as reports of the work of medical staff after a natural disaster or the kindness of volunteers who help in their communities. And our concluding sentence at the end, this news will inspire us. This kind of news might inspire us all to lead better lives. This paragraph is a bit longer. It contains 105 words and it doesn't follow a firstly, secondly, finally structure. I would call this topic sentence, then example, then result. Then we've got an alternative, the positive news, and another result of that. It's closer to an idea, explain, example paragraph, but I've written a bit more about this in the worksheet that you can get next to this lesson. So download the worksheet and you'll see a bit more about the structure of this paragraph in my questions. Moving on now to the conclusion. The conclusion in our plan, we said difficult news choices more positive. We're repeating what we've already said. Here's the beginning of my conclusion. In conclusion, it must be extremely difficult for editors to choose which news stories to present. And then, but I would like to see a more positive approach to this vital public service. We've repeated the idea that it's difficult, and we've repeated the idea that we want more positive news. We've said a more positive approach. Remember, paraphrasing is a very useful skill for this and is considered to be a sign of someone with a high level of language knowledge. Being able to paraphrase is certainly a good thing. That's the essay finished, but let's as usual check the band 7 to 9 vocabulary that we've had. This is what really makes a difference. And remember, we're not talking about linking words here. Linking words are for your organisation score. Band 7 to 9 vocabulary that I'm talking about is topic vocabulary. It's about the topic of this essay. Here we go. Exposed to bad news is good. Welcome a greater emphasis on good news. Editors face a range of considerations. Prioritise stories that are in the public interest. Under some pressure from the owners. Promote particular political views. Become accustomed to negative news. Natural disasters and tragic human suffering. Exposure gradually desensitizes people. Cynical and skeptical. Inspire us all to lead better lives. A more positive approach. Vital public service. That's all great topic vocabulary that would help this essay to achieve a band 9. As usual, you can see the full essay if you print the worksheet. There's also an exercise that talks more about structure and the vocabulary as well. Next week, we'll do one more lesson where I look at the difference between a strong opinion and a balanced opinion, and that will be our last Writing Task 2 lesson of this course.